Maple Falls, Vermont, was the kind of place people moved to when they were tired of noise. The kind of town where you could leave your front door unlocked, wave to the same faces at the general store, and trust that tomorrow would be much like today. But on the cold morning of November 14, 2010, that trust cracked. At 6:03 a.m., a call came into the Maple County 911 dispatch. The voice on the other end was steady but edged with urgency. "My husband, he's not breathing. There's blood, please send someone." The caller identified herself as Vanessa Hanlon, giving the address on Willow Ridge Lane, a quiet cul-de-sac lined with maple trees stripped bare by fall. Within minutes, the call was being relayed to local patrol units and the town's single ambulance crew. Maple Falls didn't often deal with violent crime. Most emergencies here were falls on icy driveways, tractor accidents, or the occasional break-in by a black bear looking for garbage. But this was different, deadly different. Vanessa's account, given in clipped bursts over the line, was simple. She'd woken early to find the back door ajar, the gun cabinet in their bedroom open, and her husband Greg lying in bed, blood soaking the pillow, not moving. She said their 3 boys, Logan, Mason, and Tyler, were still asleep in the guest room and she hadn't wanted to leave them. To the dispatcher, it sounded like a nightmare scenario, a break-in turned violent. But as one veteran officer would later recall, there was something controlled about the way Vanessa spoke. She wasn't sobbing. She wasn't screaming. Her tone was matter-of-fact, almost as if she were relaying events she'd practiced saying out loud. When the first patrol car pulled up, Officer Dean Murray noticed how still the Hanlon house looked. The porch light was on, but no sign of disturbance outside. No footprints in the frost, no discarded items, no forced entry. Vanessa met them at the front door, wearing a pale cardigan over pajama pants, her hair pulled into a loose bun. Her eyes were dry, her voice low. "Upstairs," she said, stepping back to let them in. The officers moved quickly, one heading to the children's room, the other to the master bedroom. There, under the pale blue quilt, lay Gregory Hanlon, age 34. The wound was unmistakable, a gunshot to the head, close range. His chest rose shallowly, but he was unresponsive. Pink froth bubbled faintly at the corner of his mouth, a sign of catastrophic trauma. Paramedics were called up immediately. While they worked to stabilize Greg for transport to the nearest trauma center in Montpelier, Officer Murray began the basic questions. Vanessa repeated the same story. She had gone to bed the night before in the guest room with the boys because Tyler, the youngest, had been fussy. She'd heard the dog bark around 5 but thought nothing of it. At 6, she woke, saw the back door ajar, and went to check on Greg. That's when she found him. Her voice didn't waver as she added, "The gun cabinet's been opened. Some of Greg's rifles are gone." The detail stood out. Most people in shock wouldn't be cataloging missing items before dialing 911. Still, in those first moments, the focus was on Greg's survival. He was rushed out, red lights fading into the distance. Back inside, Murray glanced at the gun cabinet. Its door was unlocked, but several firearms leaned neatly against the siding outside the back door, as if someone had placed them there deliberately. He frowned. Burglars didn't usually leave stolen goods behind, and they certainly didn't arrange them carefully in plain view. The rest of the house was unsettling in its orderliness. No overturned furniture. No ransacked drawers. The only sign of intrusion was the open back door, and even that lacked the marks of forced entry. Vanessa hovered in the kitchen, her hands wrapped around a coffee mug she hadn't touched. The boys were in the living room now, half awake, huddled under blankets, oblivious to what had just happened in the master bedroom. Murray asked her if she tried CPR. She shook her head. "I didn't want to leave the kids alone." The answer was plausible, but it nagged at him. Vanessa was a registered nurse. Instinct should have driven her to at least check for a pulse, especially on her own husband. By mid-morning, detectives from the Vermont State Police had arrived. Sergeant Alan Reeves took over the scene. He'd been in homicide long enough to know that the first story you hear is rarely the whole story. While forensics photographed the bedroom, Reeves walked the perimeter outside. No footprints beyond the immediate porch area. No tool marks on the doorframe. The frost on the grass was undisturbed except where officers had walked. Inside, the techs bagged a pair of latex gloves found in the kitchen trash, wadded up with paper towels. At first glance, they seemed ordinary, until one glove was turned inside out, revealing a .222 caliber shell casing tucked in the fingertip. It was like finding a single puzzle piece before you even knew the picture you were making. Meanwhile, at Hillcrest Medical Center, doctors worked on Greg for hours. But the injury was too severe. He never regained consciousness. 2 days later, with family gathered around, Gregory Hanlon was pronounced dead. The case was no longer an assault, it was a homicide. That day, Reeves sat down with Vanessa for a formal interview. She spoke about Greg as a devoted father, a man who'd traded a higher-paying, travel-heavy job for a desk position to be closer to his family. She admitted they'd argued about money. Greg wanted her to cut back on expenses, and she felt he didn't appreciate how hard she worked balancing the kids and her shifts at the clinic. Her voice broke once or twice, but there were no tears. She described their marriage as normal. Reeves pressed her. Was there anyone who might want to harm Greg? She shook her head. Any threats, debts, dangerous friends? Again, no. When the questions shifted toward the timeline, what time she came home from dinner with friends, how long she'd stayed in the guest room, her answers grew shorter. Then, without warning, she folded her hands in her lap and said, "I think I need a lawyer." The interview ended there. Back at the Hanlon house, lab techs were already processing evidence. The gloves from the trash tested positive for gunshot residue. The DNA on the inside matched both Greg and Vanessa. That meant whoever had worn them had been in close proximity to a fired weapon, and to Greg, on the night he was shot. And there was another factor: Greg's life insurance policy. Reeves learned from the couple's financial records that it was valued at $650,000. Not conclusive, but in the context of mounting debt and frequent arguments about money, it was a motive worth noting. By the end of that week, the shape of the case was shifting. What had started as a supposed home invasion was beginning to look more like something far more intimate and far more calculated. In Maple Falls, word traveled fast. Neighbors left casseroles on the Hanlons' porch, spoke in hushed tones at the diner. Most felt sympathy for Vanessa. Others whispered that her story didn't add up. For Sergeant Reeves, the question was no longer whether Greg Hanlon had been murdered. It was who had the motive, the access, and the opportunity, and how to prove it. And in the quiet spaces between interviews and evidence logs, one thought kept circling back to him. Sometimes the most dangerous intruder is the one who already has a key. Maple Falls had a way of making even strangers seem familiar. People here grew up together, attended the same schools their parents had, and often worked in the same businesses for decades. It was the kind of town where everyone knew whose truck was in whose driveway, and gossip, when it happened, traveled like wind through autumn leaves. 4 years, Greg Hanlon had been one of those steady, unshakable fixtures of the community. Born in 1976 to Harold and Diane Hanlon, he was the middle child between two sisters. Greg had been the kind of boy who never made trouble for his parents, never sought the spotlight, but quietly earned the respect of everyone around him. His father worked at a paper mill, his mother in the school district's front office. Money was never abundant, but there was enough, and there was love in the Hanlon home, of the practical, enduring kind. By the time Greg reached high school, it was clear he wasn't going to be the loudest or most outgoing student. But he had a knack for fixing things. Lawnmowers, radios, the occasional broken toaster. Greg would take them apart and put them back together, often better than they'd been before. That talent steered him toward technical studies, and later to a job as an electrical engineer for the Vermont Power Authority. He liked the work. It was hands-on, tangible. He could point to a substation upgrade or a repaired transformer and know he'd made something safer, better. But more than the work itself, Greg liked the stability it gave him. A good paycheck. Benefits. The sense that he was building a life brick by brick, the way his parents had. Vanessa, on the other hand, had grown up 2 towns over in Briarwood. She was the second of 3 daughters in a family that prided itself on appearances. Her father owned a small insurance agency, her mother organized charity events. Vanessa had been bright, outgoing, and photogenic, a combination that made her popular in high school. She joined the cheer squad, volunteered at the local hospital, and spoke often about her dream of becoming a nurse. The first time Greg and Vanessa crossed paths was at Vermont Technical College in the late 90s. Greg was studying electrical systems, Vanessa was in the nursing program. They met through a mutual friend at a campus coffee shop. Greg, reserved as always, didn't try to impress her with big talk. He listened. Vanessa liked that. For a while, they were inseparable. Weekend hikes in the Green Mountains, evenings at small-town diners, talks about the kind of house they'd someday buy. But as college ended, their paths diverged. Vanessa wanted to settle down quickly. Greg wanted to be financially ready before making that leap. The disagreement ended in a breakup that neither of them took easily. Vanessa moved to Burlington for work as a dental assistant, but the city pace wore on her. She found herself missing the slower rhythm of smaller towns, and after about a year, she returned to the area. That's when she and Greg reconnected. The second time around, there was no hesitation. Greg proposed in the spring of 2001. They married that fall in a modest ceremony at St. Paul's Church, surrounded by family and friends. People in Maple Falls remembered the day, how Vanessa seemed to glow in her ivory gown, how Greg looked like the kind of man who just found exactly what he'd been looking for. They bought a small but well-kept two-story home on Willow Ridge Lane. Greg's job provided steady income. Vanessa returned to school to finish her nursing degree. By 2004, they welcomed their first son, Logan. Mason followed in 2007, Tyler in 2009. From the outside, the Hanlons were the portrait of small-town success. Neighbors saw Greg mowing the lawn with one of the boys trailing behind with a plastic toy mower. Vanessa was often spotted at the grocery store, the younger two boys in tow, greeting people by name. The family attended Sunday services, hosted backyard barbecues in summer, and hung bright wreaths on the door each winter. But like so many pictures that look perfect from a distance, there were cracks beneath the surface. Greg's position at Vermont Power Authority required frequent travel in the early years. He didn't like being away from the kids, and he worried about the strain it put on Vanessa. When Tyler was born, Greg made a choice. He left the higher-paying, travel-heavy position for a desk job in Maple Falls. It meant more evenings at home, more help with the kids, but also a smaller paycheck. Vanessa didn't adjust her lifestyle to match the reduced income. She liked hosting gatherings, redecorating the house, buying the boys new clothes before the old ones had worn out. Greg, pragmatic by nature, started to notice the credit card balances creeping upward. Arguments followed. They were never loud enough for the neighbors to hear, but friends picked up on the tension. She'd complain about him being too frugal, one friend later told investigators. He'd complain she didn't understand how hard he worked. By 2010, the strain was showing. Greg confided to his sister that he felt trapped in a job that no longer challenged him, and that the financial pressure was constant. He didn't talk about divorce. Greg wasn't the type to give up on marriage, but the sense of frustration was there. Vanessa, for her part, kept her grievances private. In public, she still spoke warmly about Greg, still posed for family photos at community events. But those closest to her noticed she seemed restless. She worked long hours at the clinic, picked up extra shifts, but her spending habits didn't change. And then there was the matter of Greg's life insurance policy, a $650,000 plan through his employer. It was standard for someone in his position, but in the context of their financial disputes, it would later stand out to investigators like a bright flag in an otherwise muted landscape. In early November of that year, Maple Falls was preparing for its annual Winter Lights Festival. Greg and Vanessa attended the planning meeting at the community hall, sitting together but speaking little. 3 days later, Vanessa went out for dinner with friends. Hours after she returned, Greg would be found bleeding in their bed, and Maple Falls would no longer be the kind of town where you could leave your back door unlocked. Looking back, neighbors would replay those small moments. The unreadable look Greg had as he carried Mason into the house that evening, the way Vanessa lingered in her car after pulling into the driveway. At the time they seemed like nothing. But in a small town, nothing stays nothing for long. And for Sergeant Alan Reeves, sifting through the first layers of their life together, one thing was clear. In order to understand the morning of November 14th, he needed to understand the years leading up to it. Because sometimes the key to solving a crime isn't in the moment it happens. It's buried in the life that came before. November in Maple Falls carried a stillness that could fool you into thinking nothing bad could ever happen there. The streets grew quiet early, porch lights flickered on by dusk, and the air had that crisp bite that hinted winter was close. On the evening of November 13, 2010, Greg Hanlon finished raking the last of the fallen maple leaves from the front yard. He stacked the bags neatly by the curb, the way he always did, before stepping inside to the smell of tomato soup simmering in the kitchen. The boys were crowded around the small table, arguing over who got the bigger slice of grilled cheese. Vanessa was at the counter, hair freshly styled, wearing a fitted blouse and a long coat draped over her chair. She looked like she was heading somewhere, not settling in for the night. "I told you I'm meeting Allison and Claire for dinner," she said when Greg asked about the coat. Her tone was casual, but there was a flicker of impatience in her eyes. Greg nodded slowly. "All right. What time will you be back?" "Not late," she replied, slipping her arms into the coat. "Don't wait up." They had danced this dance before. Vanessa enjoyed her nights out and Greg, ever the steady one, stayed home with the boys. He didn't complain much, but he noticed the way the receipts piled up, the way the credit card balance climbed each month. Tonight, though, he said nothing. At 6:30 p.m., Vanessa's car pulled out of the driveway. Greg watched from the window for a moment before turning back to the kitchen to help Logan with his math homework. Vanessa drove to the Lantern Bistro, a small but stylish restaurant 2 towns over. She met Allison and Claire at a corner table, ordered wine, and spent the next 2 hours in animated conversation. Later, she'd tell police it was an ordinary night, just dinner with friends. But Allison would remember Vanessa checking her phone often, replying to messages with a small, unreadable smile. By 8:45 p.m., Vanessa was back in her car, the passenger seat holding a small takeout bag. She didn't head straight home. Instead, she took the long way, a route that wound past Willow Creek Pond. The water was still under the moonlight, a thin layer of ice forming along the edges. She slowed as she passed, her headlights sweeping across the shoreline. When she finally pulled into the driveway at 9:20, Greg was in the living room, the boys upstairs. He glanced at the takeout bag. "More spending?" he asked, his voice even but firm. "It's just food, Greg. Don't start." He sighed. "It's not just food. It's dinners, clothes, trips to Burlington. I'm not saying you can't have nice things, but..." "But what?" she cut in. "You took a pay cut so you could sit at a desk all day. I'm working double shifts and you act like I'm draining us dry." The argument didn't escalate into shouting, but the words were sharp. After a few minutes, Vanessa grabbed her purse and keys again. "Where are you going now?" Greg asked. "Just out," she said. "I need air." She drove aimlessly for nearly half an hour, past the darkened storefronts of Main Street, the quiet stretch of Route 12, before looping back toward Willow Ridge Lane. When she returned at 10:15, Greg was upstairs getting the boys ready for bed. Vanessa peeked into their rooms, kissed each of them goodnight, then retreated to the guest bedroom with Tyler, who was fussing. She put on an animated movie to settle him down. Greg stayed in the master bedroom, reading from a paperback mystery novel. The light under the door glowed faintly. At 11 p.m., Vanessa texted Allison, "Home now. Everything's fine." But everything wasn't fine. Somewhere in that house, tension hung thick in the air. Greg lay awake longer than usual, staring at the ceiling. Vanessa, in the guest room, scrolled through her phone with the volume low. The boys, blissfully unaware, drifted into dreams. Around midnight, the dog barked once, a sharp, quick sound, then went silent. Vanessa would later tell police she didn't think much of it. But the timeline, as investigators would later reconstruct, suggested something else, that whatever happened to Greg may have already been set in motion. By 5:15 a.m., another bark echoed through the stillness. This time, Vanessa said she woke briefly but didn't get up. She stayed curled on the small bed beside Tyler, the movie still paused on the TV screen. At 6:03 a.m. she made the call. From the outside, it would appear as though a stranger had slipped in through the back door, targeted Greg, and left without waking anyone else. But even in those early hours, small inconsistencies were already forming in the minds of the first responders. No sign of forced entry. No muddy footprints on the kitchen tile. Firearms arranged neatly outside the back door instead of being carried off. And a wife who, despite her medical training, never once checked her husband's pulse. The night before had seemed ordinary: dinner, conversation, bedtime. But in Maple Falls, nothing ordinary would ever follow again. Because sometimes the most important part of a crime story isn't the moment the crime happens. It's the last night when it could have been stopped. In small towns like Maple Falls, tragedies don't stay quiet for long. By the afternoon of November 14th, news of Greg Hanlon's death had already spread beyond Willow Ridge Lane. At the post office, in the line at Hank's General Store, people whispered in low voices, trading theories. A burglary gone wrong, they guessed. Maybe some drifter passing through. But for Sergeant Alan Reeves, the theory didn't sit right. The morning after Greg was pronounced dead, Reeves stood in the Hanlon kitchen with a legal pad in one hand, scanning the room again. It was as if the house had been paused in time, Vanessa's coffee cup still half full on the counter, the boys' cereal bowls rinsed in the sink. And yet, something about the orderliness was wrong. He moved to the back door. No pry marks. No broken lock. The frost outside was mostly untouched. There were no footprints in the grass beyond the back step except for those belonging to responding officers. And then there were the guns, half a dozen of Greg's firearms, stacked neatly outside the back door as though they'd been set down, not stolen in haste. It wasn't the scene of a panicked thief. It was the scene of someone staging an exit. Crime scene techs were methodically moving through the house. In the kitchen trash bin, one of them had found the latex gloves. Inside the fingers of one glove sat a single .222 caliber shell casing. The casing still carried faint traces of powder burn. To a trained eye, it was as if someone had tried to hide it but hadn't been careful enough. DNA swabs from the gloves came back with two profiles, Greg's and Vanessa's. That fact alone didn't prove guilt. Vanessa lived there after all, but combined with the gunshot residue also found on the gloves, it was becoming harder to dismiss. Reeves called Vanessa in for another interview on November 16th. She arrived in a charcoal gray coat, hair pulled back neatly, her voice steady. She repeated the same story she'd given before. Dinner with friends, returning home around 9:20 p.m., an argument about spending, then sleeping in the guest room with Tyler. She said she'd heard the dog bark around 5 in the morning but thought nothing of it. Vanessa, Reeves said gently, the medical examiner thinks Greg was shot closer to 3 a.m. That's hours before you say you found him. Her lips tightened. I didn't hear anything. I told you I was in the guest room with the boys. What about the guns outside the back door? I don't know. Whoever came in must have dropped them. The calmness in her tone was unusual. Reeves had seen people in shock, seen them crumble or lash out. Vanessa's composure seemed deliberate. That same day, financial records confirmed what Greg's sister had hinted at. Arguments about money had been frequent, and their credit card debt had climbed steadily in recent months. There was also Greg's life insurance policy, $650,000 with Vanessa as the sole beneficiary. Reeves kept digging. Vanessa's phone records showed she'd driven a route that took her past Willow Creek Pond on the night of November 13th, even though it wasn't the most direct way home from the Lantern Bistro. It was a detail that meant little then but would matter later. Neighbors were interviewed. Most spoke well of Vanessa, describing her as polite and attentive to her children. But a few mentioned seeing less warmth between the couple lately, Greg mowing the yard alone, Vanessa leaving in her car without much explanation. 2 weeks passed. The official cause of death was listed as a single gunshot wound to the head, fired at close range while Greg lay in bed. The lack of forced entry meant the shooter either had a key or was let in. The pool of possible suspects narrowed to a near point. Then came the break Reeves didn't expect. On November 27th, a local landowner named Clifford Barnes called the sheriff's office. He owned a property outside town with a small fishing pond. Vanessa, he said, had asked about buying the land just after Greg's death, saying Greg had always dreamed of taking the boys fishing there. Clifford thought it was a touching gesture, until a few weeks later, Vanessa called him again, this time asking if he could fill in the pond entirely. She said it like it was nothing, Clifford told Reeves. Just fill it in. But she'd been so excited about it before. Made my gut say something wasn't right. Reeves's mind clicked into gear. If Vanessa wanted the pond gone so badly, maybe it was because it held something she didn't want found. The next morning, officers searched Willow Creek Pond. Wading into the frigid water, they swept the bottom with metal detectors. The ping came fast, a .222 caliber revolver, its barrel clogged with silt. Ballistics matched it to the shell casing in the latex glove. Now the case had a weapon, a likely motive, and a suspect. But what it lacked was the kind of irrefutable evidence that could survive a defense attorney's attacks. Reeves needed Vanessa to act in a way that would seal the case. He asked Clifford to help set a trap. Clifford called Vanessa, telling her he'd decided to drain the pond before filling it in. If she had anything hidden there, the clock was now ticking. Reeves was gambling that she wouldn't be able to resist checking for herself. And on a gray morning in early December, that gamble would pay off. The morning frost still clung to the grass when Clifford Barnes picked up his phone and dialed the number. His voice was casual, the way you'd speak to a neighbor about something routine. Vanessa? It's Cliff. I've been thinking, before I fill in the pond, I'm gonna drain it. Just makes sense to get all that water out first. There was a pause on the line, barely 2 seconds, but Clifford heard it. That tiny gap before she replied, "Oh, okay. Sure, whatever you think is best." It was the lack of curiosity that struck him. No questions. No small talk. No hesitation about the pond itself. Just that measured, almost weightless tone. Clifford thanked her and hung up. Across the road, an unmarked SUV sat idling, Sergeant Alan Reeves inside with 2 plainclothes officers. They'd been listening through a wire Clifford had agreed to wear. Reeves made a note. She took the bait. The plan had been simple. Tell her the pond was going to be drained, then wait. If she'd hidden something there, the threat of it being exposed might push her to act. Reeves didn't know if she'd come alone, send someone else, or ignore it altogether. But in his experience, people rarely sit still when they believe their secrets are about to surface. 2 days later, on a cloudy Thursday morning, the temperature hovering just above freezing, Clifford's truck sat parked at the edge of Willow Creek Pond. The water was calm, the willows bending low, their bare branches trailing the surface. Hidden in the trees across the clearing, Reeves and his team watched through long lenses. At 9:17 a.m., a silver sedan turned off the gravel road and rolled slowly toward the pond. Vanessa Hanlon stepped out, dressed in waterproof boots, dark jeans, and a quilted jacket. She glanced around once, her breath visible in the cold air, then opened the trunk. From inside, she pulled a long metal rod, the kind used for breaking ice in shallow water. She waded in up to her knees, the surface rippling outward. The rod dipped into the water, probed along the muddy bottom. She took her time, moving in a slow half-circle, returning to one spot more than once. Reeves, watching through binoculars, recognized the location. It was the exact area where his team had pulled the .222 caliber revolver from the muck a week earlier. She didn't know it was gone. "She's looking for it," one of the officers murmured. Vanessa's movements grew more focused, stabbing the rod into the same patch of mud, twisting it, pulling it up, then trying again. After several minutes, she paused, scanning the bank, then slogged back toward shore. On dry ground, she set the rod aside, brushed mud from her gloves, and stood for a moment staring at the water. From a distance, she looked like someone lost in thought, maybe reminiscing about better days. But Reeves knew better. This was the face of someone calculating what to do next now that the pond might betray her. When she drove away, they let her go. The trap wasn't about catching her with the weapon, it was about catching her intent. Now they had it, recorded in high-definition video from 2 angles. That afternoon, Reeves reviewed the footage frame by frame. Vanessa's body language told its own story. The way she moved directly to the exact location, the precision of her search, the absence of any sign she was there for leisure. It was deliberate, purposeful, and it undercut every word of her earlier statements. The decision came quickly. On February 2, 2011, a warrant was issued for Vanessa Hanlon's arrest on a charge of first-degree murder. Officers found her at home, folding laundry in the living room. She didn't resist, didn't ask why. She just looked at the lead detective and said, "I guess you think you've figured it out." The courtroom was packed when her trial began nearly a year later. The prosecution laid out the pieces. The lack of forced entry, the staged gun theft, the gloves in the trash with gunshot residue and DNA, the financial strain, the life insurance policy, and finally, the footage of Vanessa at Willow Creek Pond, wading into icy water to search for something she claimed to know nothing about. The defense tried to chip away at each element. The gloves? Could have been touched earlier in some innocent context. The life insurance? Standard coverage for a man in Greg's position. The pond? Maybe she was just curious after hearing it would be drained. But when the jury saw the video, the mood in the room shifted. Jurors leaned forward, eyes narrowing. Whatever reasonable doubt had existed seemed to evaporate in that moment. On February 10, 2012, the verdict was read, guilty of first-degree murder. Vanessa showed no visible reaction as the judge sentenced her to 60 years in state prison. For Greg's family, there was no satisfaction, just a kind of numb acceptance. The 3 boys went to live with Greg's parents under a court order that barred Vanessa from any contact. In Maple Falls, the story lingered long after the trial. People still drove past Willow Creek Pond and remembered the quiet, cold morning when the surface rippled, not from wind, but from the truth trying to rise from the bottom. And in his case file, Sergeant Reeves kept one photo from that day. Not of the gun, not of the courtroom, but of Vanessa in the pond, boots deep in water, rod in hand, looking down into the murk. To him, it was the purest image of guilt, not in what you hold but in what you can't bear to leave buried. By the time Vanessa Hanlon stepped into the Maple County Courthouse, winter had tightened its grip on Vermont. The sky was a flat, frozen gray, and the steps to the courthouse had been salted twice before the first juror arrived. Inside, the air was thick with anticipation. Trials like this didn't come along often in Maple Falls. Cases where the victim was someone everyone knew, where the accused was the person they least expected. The benches in the public gallery filled quickly. Some came for justice, others for answers, and a few out of morbid curiosity. The prosecution had a clear narrative. This was not the work of a stranger. It was deliberate, personal, and driven by a mix of financial motive and marital strain. They opened with the 911 call. The audio filled the courtroom, Vanessa's steady voice describing the back door open, the missing guns, Greg not breathing. The prosecutor pointed out what wasn't there: panic, confusion, urgency. Instead, her tone was measured, even rehearsed. Then came the forensic evidence. The jury watched as an evidence technician described finding the latex gloves in the kitchen trash, pulling them from a sealed bag, and pointing to the .222 caliber shell casing tucked into one finger. Photographs of the gloves, the casing, and the lab reports showing both Greg's and Vanessa's DNA were projected on a large screen. Gunshot residue doesn't appear out of nowhere. the prosecutor said, pacing slowly before the jury. It gets there when you've handled a fired weapon, or been close enough when someone else did. The financial angle came next. A records analyst testified about the couple's rising debt, the frequent credit card use, and Greg's $650,000 life insurance policy naming Vanessa as the sole beneficiary. The implication was clear. Removing Greg would remove the financial strain and provide a payout large enough to start over. But it was the Willow Creek Pond video that silenced the room. The footage played on 2 monitors. Vanessa in waterproof boots, wading into the icy water, gripping the metal rod, probing the exact spot where the murder weapon had been found days earlier. She wasn't sightseeing. She wasn't fishing. She was searching, with precision and with purpose. Ladies and gentlemen, the prosecutor said, pausing the footage, ask yourselves why she went straight to that spot. Ask yourselves what she thought she'd find there. The defense countered with a softer picture. They reminded the jury that Vanessa was a mother of 3, a registered nurse, and a respected member of the community. They argued that the gloves could have been contaminated in the normal course of household life, that DNA transfer was not unusual in a married couple's home. As for the pond, they suggested she might have been curious after hearing it would be drained, perhaps worried about litter, perhaps thinking of Greg's fondness for fishing. The rod, they said, was simply for poking around, a Vermont pastime when you find yourself near the water. The defense called no witnesses on Vanessa's behalf, not even her. It was a gamble, one that kept her from cross-examination but left the prosecution's case largely uncontested. In closing arguments, the prosecutor leaned on the idea that murder investigations are puzzles, and in this case, every piece fit. No forced entry. No theft. No unknown fingerprints. Gloves with her DNA and gunshot residue. A staged scene. A life insurance policy. And when she thought the pond still held the weapon, she went to retrieve it. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a burglary. This was murder. The jury deliberated for less than 8 hours. When they filed back in, the courtroom went silent except for the shuffling of feet and the creak of wooden benches. On the charge of first-degree murder, the foreperson read, "We find the defendant, Vanessa Hanlon, guilty." Vanessa stood still, hands clasped in front of her. She didn't cry, didn't speak. Her attorney placed a hand on her shoulder, but she kept her eyes forward. The judge sentenced her to 60 years in the Vermont State Prison for Women. With good behavior, she could be eligible for parole in 2041. Without it, she'd be an old woman before she saw freedom again. For Greg's parents, who now had custody of Logan, Mason, and Tyler, the verdict brought no joy. "We lost Greg," his mother said quietly to reporters outside the courthouse. "And in a way we lost Vanessa too. The boys have lost both parents. There's no winning here." In Maple Falls, the trial was the talk of every diner booth and barstool for weeks. People replayed the footage in their minds, debated the strength of the evidence, and wondered how a marriage that had once seemed so solid could end with a body in a bed and a verdict in a courtroom. For Sergeant Reeves, it was a case that would stay with him, not because of the complexity but because of the simplicity. "It's always the little things," he told a rookie months later. "A glove in the trash. A door left open. A pond nobody thinks to look in. And a person who can't stand the thought of what might float back up." When the verdict was read and the courtroom emptied, winter's chill outside felt sharper. The sound of boots crunching on salted pavement mixed with low murmurs from people leaving the courthouse. Some avoided eye contact, others shook their heads in disbelief. In the days that followed, the news coverage slowed, but the ripples in Maple Falls did not. In small towns, big cases don't simply fade. They embed themselves into the fabric of local memory. People would point to the Hanlon house on Willow Ridge Lane for years, telling visitors, "That's where it happened." For Greg's parents, Harold and Diane, the legal end brought no peace. They'd sat through every day of testimony, listened to the forensic details, watched the pond footage more times than they could count. But for them, the true weight of the case wasn't in the evidence. It was in the 3 boys now living under their roof. Logan, at 7, understood enough to know his father wasn't coming home. Mason, barely 4, asked questions no grandparent ever wants to answer. Tyler, still a toddler, would grow up with only faint impressions from old photographs. The court's custody order was explicit. Vanessa Hanlon was to have no contact, direct or indirect, with her children. The restraining order would remain in place until each of them reached adulthood. In legal terms, it was protection. In human terms, it was a severing. Neighbors described seeing Harold out front one Saturday in early spring, helping Logan fix the chain on his bike. It was the kind of thing Greg would have done, but now done in silence without the easy jokes Greg used to toss over his shoulder. Vanessa was transferred to the Vermont State Prison for Women, a squat concrete facility 2 hours from Maple Falls. In her first intake interview, she maintained her innocence. "I didn't kill Greg," she told the intake officer flatly. "They wanted someone to blame and I was convenient." She refused all media requests, and over time her name disappeared from the local paper's front page, replaced by new headlines. But in town, the trial left behind fractures. Some still believed she'd been railroaded, pointing to the lack of eyewitnesses, the circumstantial nature of the evidence. Others were convinced of her guilt, saying no innocent person wades into an icy pond with a metal rod, searching the exact spot where a murder weapon was found. Sergeant Alan Reeves moved on to other cases, but the Hanlon file remained on his shelf. Sometimes on slow days he'd pull it down and flip through the photographs. The back door open to the frost, the neatly arranged guns, the gloves in the trash. And the still frames from the pond footage. Vanessa's face set in concentration, water rippling around her knees. What stayed with him most was the ordinariness of it all. There were no shadowy strangers, no sudden bursts of violence in public. Just a house, a marriage, and choices made behind closed doors. He'd learned long ago that in homicides, it's not always the dramatic moments that matter most, it's the quiet ones. As the years passed, the Hanlon boys grew into their own lives. The older two played baseball for the high school team. Tyler developed a love for drawing. They rarely spoke about the trial, but when they did, it was to each other in the privacy only siblings understand. The Hanlon house on Willow Ridge Lane was eventually sold. New owners repainted the siding, replaced the kitchen, planted lilac bushes in the front yard. But for those who knew its history, the fresh paint didn't erase what had happened there. In the records of the Vermont Department of Corrections, Vanessa Hanlon's earliest parole eligibility date is listed as February 2041. She will be 64 years old. If denied, her sentence runs until 2071, a date so distant it feels abstract. For Greg, there is no date. His life is fixed, the years he might have had gone. His gravestone in the small Maple Falls Cemetery is simple. Name, dates, and a short line chosen by his parents. A steady heart, a quiet strength. The people who knew him say that's exactly who he was. A man who didn't need attention, who valued doing right over being noticed. A man who traded a higher paycheck for more time at home. And that's the sharpest cut of all, the idea that someone like Greg Hanlon could be taken not by the randomness of fate, but by the deliberate act of someone who once promised to stand beside him for life. On certain winter mornings, when the mist clings to Willow Creek Pond and the air hangs heavy with silence, the scene looks almost peaceful. But for those who remember, it is not the stillness of calm, it is the stillness of a truth buried, then pulled to the surface one cold step at a time.